Hello and welcome. I'm Ali Mustafa with a special edition of Straight Talk from a Turkey-Qatari training facility in Doha, Qatar. Nearly 1 year ago, the tiny state of Qatar found itself under siege by its neighbours. Neighbours it had relied on to keep its economy running. The Saudi-led blockade shook the GCC and challenged the very fundamentals of Qatari sovereignty, a provocation that Doha continues to defy with the help of a few friends from Turkey. An urban counter-terrorism exercise. It might feel like an intense session of Counter-Strike, but for these men, this is no game. This is the kind of relationship Turkey and Qatar want to establish. Two friendly countries training together to combat joint threats, including terrorism. Fighting Daesh and the PKK is an important goal.
1, 2, 3, go!
But regional tensions have made this a complicated mission for the Turks. Last June, a group of countries led by Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates imposed a complete blockade of Qatar, accusing Doha of backing terrorism and of fostering ties with Iran. Qatar strongly denies the terrorism charge and says its independent foreign policy means good relations with all neighbours, including Tehran. Turkey signed an agreement with Qatar in 2014 to station land, naval and air forces. Currently, about 500 Turkish troops are on the peninsula. They're led by men like Osman Ilergil. The French and English-speaking colonel says Turkey has taken an active approach in helping countries around the world fight terrorism.
Actually, the world is getting smaller day by day, and terrorism is a huge threat for all countries. In this regard, every country should work with each other against terrorism. We are carrying out our activities in this context.
An intimate relationship is developing between the Turkish and Qatari militaries. They're trying to communicate in each other's language at a time when Qatar finds itself isolated.
It is a great honor for me to be one of the first officers that worked with the Turkish armed forces upon their arrival in Qatar. I have benefited greatly from their expertise and benefited from the well-known legacy of the Turkish military. The goal of the joint Qatari-Turkey program is to increase the defense capabilities and to strengthen anti-terror operations between the two countries. We cooperated in a number of programs and operations with the Turkish forces. We benefited greatly from the Turkish experts in this regard. From the first day of the siege, Qatar was able to break it. We started to depend on ourselves in all aspects.
An important partnership and a chance to learn a new language for these Turkish and Qatari soldiers. A sign of Turkey's deep commitment to an independent Qatar. I met Fikret Ozer, Turkey's ambassador to Doha, and asked him what were Ankara's ambitions in Qatar.
Türkiye ile Katar iki dost, iki kardeş ülke.
We are two friendly brother countries, Turkey and Qatar. We have relationships at the highest level and connections in every area. The biggest challenge I've faced has been to tighten this relationship even more, increase trade volume, and close the gap between the current situation and what we aim for. Of course, there are reasons for this. As you know, there have been parties and countries that have been working for years in Qatar's foreign trade and foreign relations.
There is also the presence of Turkish military in Qatar. working alongside the Qataris as part of joint exercises. Tell us about Turkey's military objectives and presence in Qatar.
Buradaki Türk askerinin bulunuşu
As you know, the presence of Turkish troops here is not about the embargo. It's a result of the agreement made with Qatar in 2014, and our soldiers came here in 2015. The deal is not for any country, it is only for Qatar. The Turkish army assists Qatar and supports the security in the Gulf. There is no question that the Turkish army protects the Saudi border. The Turkish army is stationed at the military base allocated to it. The soldiers perform exercises with the Qatari army. Most recently, the Turkish Air Force transferred 3 F-16 fighter jets to Qatar and conducted joint exercises. The Turkish Air Force has F-16s, while the Qatari Air Force uses French-made fighter jets. They did exercises to provide coordination.
birikimi iki ülke arasında yardımlaşma ve bölgenin güvenliğine hizmettir.
Tensions are rising between the US and Iran. The US has pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal. There is a threat of conflict, even though a lot of people say it might not happen. But if it does happen, if there is conflict between the US and Iran, and if the Americans use the base in Qatar, what would be Turkey's position?
Buradaki Türk kuvvetlerinin
The Turkish army services are limited to Qatar, but Qatar is also at the center of the U.S. Central Command. The American Central Forces will continue to do whatever it does. In the meantime, there is also a question now between the U.S. and Iran. Qatar's only aerial corridor is over Iran. These are critical questions facing Qatar. We will receive the answer in time. We hope that this tension will not reach a level that would violate peace in the region. Our region now needs peace, not war.
birbirinden ayrı bir şey.
Ambassador, thank you. The blockade of Qatar was rooted in the events that shook the Middle East and North Africa more than 7 years ago. I'm talking about the 2011 Arab Spring. Now, the Saudi-led bloc's anger with Qatar stems from Doha's support for Arab youth activists during those demonstrations. Celebrations at Cairo's Tahrir Square signal a new beginning for Egyptians. It marked the end of Hosni Mubarak's 30-year iron-fisted rule. He was swept from power alongside strongmen from Tunisia to Libya after weeks of protests. The events were streamed to millions of viewers by the Qatar-based Al Jazeera Media Network, inspiring people like Marwan Kabalan. 7 years ago, Kabalan was teaching at the Kalamoun University in Damascus. Now living in exile in Doha, he tells us how Qatar's role changed perceptions in the Arab world.
Well, I think this is partly the outcome of the Arab Spring. In the Arab Spring, I think Qatar decided actually to abandon its the middle ground role that it used to play for the past decade, in fact. And Qatar decided actually to go with the voice of the people, because that was for Qatari elite, the Qatari leadership. Actually, that was a moral position before becoming a political one. When they have people revolted against the leadership of the authoritarian regime in Tunisia and particularly in Egypt in 2011, I think the Qatari leadership decided to go in support of the masses who are actually aspiring for democracy, for freedom, for better living standard, and to get rid of all of these corrupt leaderships.
While it continued to inspire millions, the Arab Spring itself was short-lived. In Egypt, a coup by General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi overthrew the democratically elected Mohamed Morsi. In Syria, Assad gradually crushed the rebel resistance with Russian and Iranian firepower. Al Jazeera's fortunes too shifted dramatically. Sisi banned the network in Egypt, imprisoning its journalists. Now Egypt, backed by the United Arab Emirates, is demanding Qatar shut down Al Jazeera, one of the top demands of the Saudi-led bloc. I caught up with Giles Trendle, who heads the Al Jazeera Media Network, and asked him why Al Jazeera had become so politicized in the current crisis?
Difficult to know, really. I mean, we still are a little unsure what was behind all the demands, but I think in terms of Al Jazeera, it's well known that Al Jazeera has been covering the region, covering the world. We are a media network that takes pride in our journalism and takes pride in asking strong questions wherever they need to be asked, of covering events all over the world. And when you had the Arab Spring in 2011, we were on the streets covering the events with the people, with the governments, asking questions. We were reporting factually and frankly and fairly on all the events. And I think there are some, let's say, players in the region who find that maybe disturbing, threatening in some way.
You talk about players in the region. The United Arab Emirates came out and said that Al Jazeera needed to be shut down because it was being used as a propaganda tool by Qatar to interfere in the internal affairs of neighboring countries.
We are doing our jobs as journalists by covering events in the world. Now, of course, there are these accusations, but we reject such accusations. We are journalists. Our job is to cover what's happening in the world. We do it in an objective way, we do it in a professional way, and we stand by the credibility and the integrity of our journalism. There are many accusations, but I think they're unfounded and baseless.
What has changed in these past few months as far as the blockade is concerned, as far as Al Jazeera's position in all of this?
Look, from day one, we found the demands outrageous, but we were not necessarily completely surprised because we've heard these accusations before, and we know that the countries in question, in their own home countries, the media is regulated, heavily regulated, even suppressed, and that we saw this as a means of trying to export that suppression of the media. But from day one, the people here, all the employees were at their desks. We were calm, and we just kept, it was like the famous wartime poster, "Keep calm and carry on," the famous World War II poster. That's really what we did, despite the fact that we were, in a way, part of the story. No journalist, as I'm sure you will appreciate, likes to be at the center of a story. We report stories. We don't like to be at the center of them.
What do you think Al Jazeera has done over the past decade, 2 decades, in the Middle East? And why do you think that has become so controversial for a lot of these
We cover all sides of the story. It's in the very DNA of what we do. We cover all sides of the story. So Al Jazeera Arabic was the first Arabic channel to feature Israeli spokespeople, speaking direct, live, phone-ins. I remember, when Al Jazeera Arabic started, to have a live phone-in was seen as something revolutionary in a region where you were used to having state-run media, where the news would be what the president was doing, or what the leader was doing, who they were meeting. That was the first half an hour of the news bulletin in the state-run media. So Al Jazeera, when it started about 22 years ago, really revolutionized that in the region. And we've been doing the same ever since. But when you have governments and regimes that only want one narrative being told to their people and to the region, then when you present multiple or different narratives, when you're doing your job as a journalist, they don't like that, because they don't like these other narratives to be aired, broadcast, heard, listened to. They just want their one narrative, and that's their one version of truth, of their truth, and they don't like other narratives.
Looking forward, Qatar finds itself in a very difficult position once again with the US president pulling out of the Iran deal. Where do you think Al Jazeera and Qatar go from here, as far as having, taking sides or being pushed into a corner to take sides?
Look, I mean, it's a new development in the region. Personally, I think all of us are concerned about what's going to happen, and I don't speak just as a journalist, I speak as a human being. All around the world there is concern about where this might go. But as journalists, whatever the developments, we will cover them, and we're here in the region, and we will carry on covering these events.
Thank you so much. The Saudi-led blockade was hoping to choke Qatar economically, but the shortage of daily goods didn't sow divisions in Qatari society. Instead, it galvanized a new sense of nationalism, one that included 2 million foreigners. She's Qatar's first female graffiti artist. But Asil Sudalav Dian is in fact an expat from Sudan. Sudalav's art focuses on women's rights. But recently, she picked up the can in defense of her adopted country. Sudalav is part of a collective that used graffiti at Doha's famous old fire station to mark 100 days of the siege of Qatar by its neighbors. We met the artist almost a year after the siege to ask her about life in Qatar as an expat during the blockade.
As an expat, it really connected me with a lot of locals, because a lot of locals were actually coming up and thanking me for being with Qatar and being with them against this blockade. And I mean, I've lived here for a very long time. I've never actually felt like I was home, but during that period, having been the only female in this project spoke volumes and connected me to the women of Qatar, and not just Qatar, but everyone in the GCC. I think I spoke in behalf of them, or I was acting in behalf of them, and when it comes to choosing something that's unconventional. So regardless of the blockade or not, I think people still appreciated, whether in Qatar or otherwise, that I was doing something that gave them a sense of women empowerment in this region.
90% of people living in Qatar aren't Qatari citizens. Outsiders run almost everything in the country. And at the time of the siege, the outsiders came together with Qatari citizens to express their solidarity. Images of resistance can be seen across Doha, like this one by Serbian artist Dmitry Bulgaraski. Dmitry says he wanted to tell Qataris he stood with them against the blockade.
Even the situation was bad, there were so many positive things going on, which are the support between each other. I never seen that the people support their own country in that measure like I saw it here. Everybody was united, so everybody was showing the same kind of support to each other, to the country, whether they were expats among expats or expats and the locals between each other.
To better understand the idea of Qatari nationalism among the country's expats, I met Sultan Barakat from the Doha Institute and asked him how the blockade had affected the foreigners.
It has actually brought them together even closer. I think it has consolidated a lot of that nationalist feeling. The intention of the blockade, or part of it, was to try and destabilize the country by stirring up some kind of opposition. And I think it totally backfired. They received exactly the opposite result. Now very much the Emir is supported, loved by everyone. And if the only thing that happened is that those who were on the fringes, maybe thinking alternatively, trying to develop some ideas far from the mainstream, have, if anything, now been exposed, and they disappeared from society. There's just they have no voice anymore. So I think it has consolidated that national feeling, and Qatar has been very smart dealing with the residents, because somehow you ask residents in the country who are not nationals, and they feel equally supportive. They were made to feel that they're part of the same challenge, facing the same challenge. Everyone has to carry their own bit, and everything from the statement of the Emir in September in the General Assembly, where he acknowledged the residents and the role they play in building the economy of Qatar, the culture of Qatar, all the way to them now reviewing residency law, trying to advance the visa procedure, etc. All of this has helped to bring not just the 300,000 together, but the 2.5 million people.
Some would say under pressure as a result of these demands that were made.
I think a lot of those policies were in the making beforehand, to be honest. but it was accelerated under pressure. I think if you look at the progressive politics that Qatar has been pursuing, and this part of the problem with the Saudis for the last 15 years.
Progressive politics, according to you and according to Qatar, but the Saudis say,
they
and
see
the Emiratis say,
they see it threatening.
Politics of interference, politics of disruption.
They see it threatening, I think, because it doesn't really dove well with their autocratic ways of doing things and them sticking to the past patterns. I think the Qataris have been very much forward-looking in a number of areas, including media, Al Jazeera, freedom of speech, expression.
Not necessarily democracy, but...
not necessarily democracy. I don't think they've ever claimed that they are a democratic society or ruled in a democratic pattern.
But they have pushed in that direction as a result of this blockade. Would they?
They've accelerated plans that have been in the making for some time. The Shura Council, the elections in the municipalities. The elections in the municipalities took place before the blockade. The Shura Council, the idea that members of the Shura Council will be elected, has been talked about for a long time, and it's been postponed.
There is convergence as far as Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Iran are concerned, that they all have these vast resources, energy resources. But in the case of Saudi Arabia and Qatar, these resources or the global demand for them is waning. Do you think oil and energy plays into the tensions in the GCC as well somehow?
It surely does, but I think again, if you look at if you contrast Saudi Arabia to Qatar for a minute, Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 was only created or thought about last year or the year before. Qatar's Vision 2030 was in the making since 2008. And the whole billions of dollars they invested in things like Qatar Foundation. The objective of it was to move the economy into knowledge-based economy. They invested in higher education and research, and now you can count Qatar amongst the nations that publish original research around the world and create knowledge and so on. So that has been, I think, the vision for a long time. Now, clearly, there's been conflict in visions and speeds. I think if you look at around us here, in the last 20 years, what they've achieved is absolutely amazing. If you take it in Europe, could be 20 years could be spent debating a new infrastructure project, whether it should go through this city or not, conservation, etc. Here, the speed of change is incredible. And they've done very well to manage it, I think, compared to other countries. Now, that has largely been achieved by having the freedom of exporting gas. Had they relied on gas export through Saudi Arabia or stuck to that idea of a pipeline, I think there would have been total disaster. What they've done, which was extremely smart, is to develop the liquid gas technology and then be able to access the whole world through the seas. And this thing was not affected by the blockade, and you could see it in their economy today. It is a rentier state, it relies on gas, it continues to rely largely on gas, but the blockade has helped them also focus more on diversing their economy. They started to manufacture better.
Transport.
Yeah, they are indigenizing a lot of industries, including transport and lots of other areas. Yeah.
We see Turkey in an interesting position as well in all of this. It has at least 500 soldiers, officers in Qatar, working closely with Qatari officers and soldiers. What is Turkey's long-term goal in Qatar and the region vis-a-vis Iran and Saudi Arabia as well?
Well, I think the agendas of both Turkey and Qatar meet on a number of areas. Vis-a-vis, say, Palestine, they're very close with Erdogan. Their vision on what should have happened in Syria was very much aligned for a long time. Their relationship with Iran is an area where they both agree that we don't need to make an enemy of Iran, but we don't have to be total friends with it. So there are a number of areas in East Africa where they agree together. And again, the idea of having soldiers coming to Qatar was in fact in the making before the blockade.
What is the way forward for Qatar, and where does this crisis end for the country, the blockade end, because these demands are still ongoing?
The demands are still ongoing, and I think the position in Qatar is still refusing all of those demands. on the basis that they touch on issues of sovereignty. Having said that, I think there has been some moves. A few weeks ago, the head of the Qatari army was in Riyadh taking part in a regional meeting. Before that, Qatar participated in a countering terrorism meeting held in Kuwait and sponsored by the Saudis and the Americans. And also, I think last week there was a similar meeting in Tajikistan. There was another one in Kuwait. So there are some contacts taking place. I mean, if you look at a lot of the international initiatives, say on counterterrorism as an example, Qatar is a member of all of those and supports them very well.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And that's all for this special edition of Straight Talk from Doha, Qatar. If you've got any comments or suggestions, do share them with us at #StraightTalk on Twitter. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Until next time, take care and goodbye.